The world of Kharos did not welcome the weak. Its mountains bled rivers of molten stone. Volcanoes towered like black giants, their peaks hidden beneath endless curtains of ash. Every gust of wind carried glowing embers across the dark plains, and every city was carved from volcanic glass strong enough to withstand centuries of eruptions. To outsiders, Kharos looked like a world forever at war with itself. To the Kharosi, it was home. Fire forged everything worth keeping. Strength was proven by endurance. Honor was earned through sacrifice. No civilization in the outer spiral questioned that truth, which was exactly why diplomats rarely visited. The Grand Hall of Embers stood at the heart of the capital, built into the side of an ancient volcano whose lava chambers still glowed beneath the polished obsidian floors. Today, the hall was filled with representatives from nearly a dozen neighboring systems. Trade agreements, mining rights, military alliances. The gathering had taken years to arrange. Rows of towering Kharosi warriors lined the ceremonial chamber, their crimson armor gleaming beneath rivers of flowing magma visible behind transparent crystal walls. Between them stood delegates of every imaginable species. Tall insectoid merchants clicked their mandibles nervously. Blue-skinned scholars whispered translations into hovering recorders. Massive reptilian ambassadors remained perfectly still, watching every movement with golden eyes. Near the rear of the chamber stood one figure almost everyone ignored. A human, Elias Morgan. He wore no ceremonial armor. No jeweled robes. Just a simple dark utility jacket with the insignia of Earth's diplomatic engineering corps stitched onto one shoulder. His assignment wasn't political. He maintained equipment, repaired damaged translation devices, solved technical problems before anyone important noticed them. Exactly the kind of work Elias preferred. Invisible work. Translation relay should remain stable now. Elias closed the maintenance panel beside one of the diplomatic platforms. A tiny floating drone chirped happily. Repair complete. About time, muttered an elderly insectoid delegate. Our interpreter kept translating peace as fermented fungus. Elias smiled. I adjusted the language matrix. It should stop insulting everyone. Several nearby diplomats chuckled. Even a pair of stern Kharosi guards exchanged amused glances. Humans, they had decided, were curious creatures. Small, physically unimpressive, useful with machines, mostly harmless, certainly not warriors, certainly not figures worthy of legend. Elias seemed perfectly content with that reputation. At the far end of the chamber, massive bronze doors slowly opened. Every conversation stopped. Queen Vale entered. She was taller than nearly every warrior present, her black ceremonial armor etched with silver patterns resembling flowing lava. A crimson cloak trailed behind her as she walked with effortless confidence. Across her back rested the symbol of her throne, the blade of judgment. Unlike ordinary weapons, the sword seemed alive. Its dark metal shifted subtly beneath the light, as though liquid fire moved beneath its surface. Ancient runes shimmered faintly along its length before fading once more. Even foreign delegates instinctively lowered their eyes. Everyone had heard the stories. Some dismissed them as mythology. Others believed every word. According to Kharosi history, the blade had chosen every rightful ruler for over 6,000 years. It rejected thieves. It rejected pretenders. It rejected conquerors driven by pride. And anyone unworthy enough to touch it. Burned. Not burned by ordinary flame. Judgment fire. A sacred fire said to consume body, mind, and soul alike. No trial. No appeal. Only ash. Whether the tales were literal hardly mattered. No one was willing to test them. Queen Vale approached the throne dais at the center of the chamber. The diplomats bowed respectfully. My honored guests, she said, her voice calm yet commanding. Kharos welcomes those who seek peace over conquest. A murmur of approval spread through the hall. She removed the blade from her back with practiced grace. The chamber grew even quieter. Even the lava flowing beyond the crystal walls seemed to fade beneath the weight of the moment. With slow reverence, she lowered the weapon toward its ceremonial pedestal beside the throne. Then, a sharp metallic crack echoed overhead. Everyone looked up. One of the enormous volcanic crystal chandeliers shifted unexpectedly. A support chain snapped. The massive fixture lurched sideways. Guards shouted warnings. Delegates scattered. Queen Vale instinctively stepped aside as fragments of volcanic crystal rained across the polished floor. The sudden movement threw off her balance for only a heartbeat. But one heartbeat was enough. The blade slipped from her grasp. The weapon struck the obsidian floor with a ringing note that echoed through the chamber. Once, twice, then it slid across the polished stone. Straight toward the diplomatic delegation. Straight toward Elias. Silence swallowed the room. Absolute silence. Nobody moved. Not even the guards. The sword came to rest only a few steps from the unsuspecting human. Elias looked down. Well, he glanced around. Everyone stood frozen. The queen, the guards, the priests. Even the ambassadors seemed afraid to breathe. He frowned slightly. He pointed toward the sword. Someone dropped this? No one answered. Instead, several Kharosi warriors visibly backed away. An elderly priest raised a trembling hand. No. His voice barely escaped his throat. Do not touch it. Elias blinked. It's the queen's sword. Exactly. I should probably hand it back. A younger guard suddenly shouted. Stop. Another joined him. Human. Step away. But Elias had already reached the obvious conclusion. Someone had dropped something important. The polite thing to do was return it. Simple. He crouched, wrapped one hand around the hilt, and lifted. For one impossible heartbeat. Nothing happened. Then the blade awakened. Crimson light exploded from the ancient runes. The weapon roared to life. A wave of scorching heat blasted across the chamber, knocking loose banners from the walls. The lava outside flared brighter in response. Several diplomats stumbled backward. Priests cried out in horror. The judgment fire. It has begun. The crimson flames surged up the blade like liquid sunlight, racing toward Elias's hand. Every warrior present expected the same inevitable ending. They had seen it before. The fire would reach his skin. There would be a scream, then nothing but drifting ash. Instead, the flames engulfed his hand. Elias flinched. Ow! His face tightened in genuine pain. His grip instinctively loosened. But he remained standing. Alive. Confused. He stared at his hand. His skin had reddened instantly, yet it remained intact. The fire continued to burn, not consuming him. Almost. Clinging to him. The entire chamber watched in stunned silence. Queen Vale's amber eyes widened. Impossible. Elias looked toward her apologetically. I think. He took a cautious step forward, extending the sword. This belongs to you. Before she could answer, the crimson flames suddenly surged with terrifying force. They wrapped around his palm like molten chains. The hilt glowed white-hot. A sickening hiss echoed through the chamber as steel and flesh became one. Elias gasped, his jaw clenching against the agony. The blade of judgment had fused itself to his hand. The panic spread faster than wildfire across dry grass. Warriors who had never retreated from battle scattered down the black stone terraces, crashing into one another as they fled the shrine. Shields were abandoned where they fell. Spears clattered across the basalt. Even towering veterans, scarred from decades of war, looked over their shoulders with naked terror. The fire bearer, the prophecy, the blade has awakened. Their voices echoed through the volcanic valley until they blended into one deafening roar. Only one figure remained standing atop the shrine, Commander Elias. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she stared at the human below. He wasn't attacking. He wasn't celebrating. He looked confused, very confused. The sword still blazed with white fire, its flames curling around his arm like living creatures. The heat pouring from it distorted the air, turning the space around him into a shimmering haze. Yet Elias simply frowned at his burned palm. Well, he muttered to himself, that's going to blister. The words reached Elias despite the distance. She almost couldn't believe what she had heard. That was his concern. Not the legendary curse. Not the fire. A blister. Archers. The command exploded across the arena. Captain Roger stormed forward with 24 royal guards close behind him. Unlike the fleeing warriors, the captain forced himself to advance, though every instinct screamed at him to run. He leveled his spear toward Elias. Do not move. Elias blinked. I wasn't planning to. Drop the blade. I've been trying. The captain hesitated. The answer wasn't defiant. It was honest. Elias slowly extended the sword away from his body. I really don't think I should keep holding this. He loosened his fingers. Nothing happened. The weapon remained firmly in his grip. His brow furrowed. That's strange. He tried again. His burned fingers opened completely. The sword didn't fall. It clung to his hand as though welded to it. A ripple of horror swept through the watching priests. It has chosen. No. It has claimed him. Captain Roger swallowed hard. Remove it. I'm trying. Elias shook his hand once, then twice. The sword refused to leave. His expression shifted from confusion to mild annoyance. Seriously? Several guards exchanged uncertain looks. This wasn't how cursed beings behaved. They expected madness. They expected bloodlust. Instead, the human looked like a mechanic dealing with a stubborn wrench. High Priest Sarikar pushed through the terrified crowd. His robes dragged across volcanic ash as he approached the shrine, leaning heavily on a staff carved from ancient obsidian. His age showed in every movement. His eyes, however, remained terrifyingly sharp. No one attack. Captain Roger looked at him in disbelief. High Priest, no one. The curse? I said. The old priest's voice carried surprising strength. No one. Silence followed. Sarikar stared directly at Elias. The white flames reflected in his ancient eyes. I have studied the blade for 112 cycles. His voice barely rose above a whisper. I have witnessed kings perish, warlords, conquerors, children foolish enough to touch the altar. They all became ash. He took another slow step. But never. His grip tightened around his staff. Has the blade burned without consuming? The words settled over the arena like fresh snow. Every warrior knew the stories. None knew this possibility existed. Elias looked up carefully. So, he raised his scorched hand slightly. Does anybody know how to turn this thing off? Several guards physically flinched. The high priest almost laughed. Not because anything was funny, because no one had ever asked that question before. You truly do not know what you hold. No, I don't even know why everyone's screaming. The honesty in his voice carried no deception. Elias watched every movement, every word, every expression. Nothing matched the image painted by ancient prophecy. The fire-bearer was supposed to be a conqueror wrapped in flame, a destroyer, a monster. Instead, this one apologized every time someone stumbled near him. It made no sense. Suddenly the flames surged. White fire spiraled upward several meters into the sky. The ground trembled beneath everyone's feet. Fresh cracks split the ancient basalt. The eternal flame atop the shrine exploded higher in response. Priests dropped to their knees. One began chanting in a language so old that few alive understood its meaning. Another covered his face. The first fire returns. High Priest Sarikar closed his eyes. He knew the words. He wished he didn't. Slowly, painfully, he spoke the forbidden verse. When the fire refuses its feast, when ash becomes flesh, the world burner walks again. The chanting stopped. Absolute silence followed. Every warrior heard it. Every warrior understood. The world burner, a name whispered only in sealed temples. The being said to have ended civilizations before recorded history. Not through hatred, not through conquest, simply because no force in existence could stop him. Captain Roger took an involuntary step backward. Then another. The other guards copied him. Only Elias remained exactly where he stood. His breathing had grown heavier. Sweat covered his forehead. The skin of his right hand had become an angry crimson, with angry blisters beginning to rise beneath the relentless white fire. The pain was unmistakable now. Every nerve screamed. His fingers trembled. His jaw locked so tightly his teeth ached. Yet he refused to cry out. Instead, he glanced toward the nearest fleeing civilians. Family. 2 small children had frozen in fear behind a collapsed stone pillar. The flames around the blade pulsed toward them. Elias immediately turned his body. He twisted away, placing himself between the children and the expanding fire. The movement drew another gasp from the crowd. He wasn't shielding himself. He was shielding strangers. The flames licked across his shoulder instead. The smell of scorched fabric filled the air. His shirt blackened instantly. Still, he didn't move. The children stared up at him with wide eyes. "It's okay," Elias said quietly, though his voice shook with pain. "Stay behind me." Beelira's eyes widened. Now she understood. He wasn't fighting the blade. He wasn't trying to master it. He was constantly adjusting his position to direct the fire away from everyone else. Every time the flames surged toward the crowd, he stepped into their path. Every burst scorched him instead of those nearby. No warrior had noticed. No priest had noticed. Only she had been watching closely enough. She whispered. Captain Roger turned toward her. "Commander?" Her voice barely escaped her lips. "He's protecting us." The word spread from guard to guard like another shockwave. Protecting them? The very people threatening to execute him? High Priest Sarikar slowly lowered his staff. His centuries of certainty began to crack. Perhaps the ancient legends had forgotten something. Or perhaps they had misunderstood everything. Before anyone could speak again, the blade vibrated with a deep metallic hum. The white flames condensed into thin streams of light racing along its black surface. One by one, ancient symbols flared into existence. Glowing white runes no living Kharosi had seen illuminated the length of the blade of ash. The forgotten language of its creators had awakened for the first time in thousands of years. No one dared touch the blade of judgment. Not after the ancient runes had awakened. Not after the white fire had obeyed an ordinary human. And certainly not after Queen Vale herself had declared that Elias was to remain alive. The command had stunned the court almost as much as the sword itself. Captain Roger had protested. The prophecy calls him the world burner. Vale had met the captain's gaze without flinching. The prophecy also failed to mention that the world burner shields children. Silence had answered her. She had seen what no one else had. When the fire surged toward the frightened civilians, Elias had stepped into its path. Every movement he made had directed the flames away from innocent lives, accepting the burns himself. That was not the instinct of a destroyer. It was the instinct of a protector. Whether the ancient legends understood the difference. She intended to find out. Hours later, Deep beneath the royal fortress, enormous stone doors groaned open for the first time in generations. Dust rolled into the corridor like ghostly fog. Elias looked around cautiously as he followed Queen Vale through the passage. I didn't realize palaces came with secret basements. Vale almost smiled despite the tension. This is not a basement. Her voice echoed through the darkness. It is where our ancestors hid the truths they feared. Behind them walked High Priest Sarikar, Captain Roger, and a handful of carefully chosen royal scholars. None carried drawn weapons. Not because they trusted Elias completely, because every legend agreed on one point. If he truly was the fire-bearer, ordinary weapons would accomplish nothing. The thought made several guards visibly uneasy. Elias noticed. He said quietly, "I'm still not planning to attack anybody." Captain Roger answered without looking at him. Legends rarely ask permission. The corridor opened into a chamber unlike anything Elias had imagined. Its ceiling disappeared into darkness, supported by pillars carved directly from black volcanic stone. Endless shelves stretched into the distance, filled with crystal tablets, metallic cylinders, ancient scrolls sealed inside transparent cases, and strange devices whose purpose had long been forgotten. The air smelled of ash and old parchment. No windows, no sound, only history. Sarikar lowered his staff. The Hall of Origins. Elias turned slowly. All of this. Our oldest records. How old? The old priest hesitated. We no longer know. Even that answer carried weight. Civilizations measured themselves by history. The Kharosi admitted they could no longer remember theirs. Scholars hurried through the archive. Some searched shelves. Others activated ancient projectors. Several carefully compared the glowing symbols now engraved across Elias's fused sword with carvings preserved inside the vault. Minutes passed, then hours. No one spoke much, until I found it. A young archivist nearly dropped the crystal tablet in his excitement. Everyone rushed toward him. Projected into the air appeared the exact symbols now glowing along the blade. Perfectly preserved. Queen Vale leaned closer. The royal forging records? The archivist swallowed. No. His voice shook. Earlier. Much earlier. He enlarged the damaged inscription. The translation slowly assembled itself from thousands of linguistic comparisons. Archive designation. Project Sentinel. Captain Roger frowned. I have never heard that title. Sarikar had. His face turned pale. No. Cannot be. More records emerged. Broken fragments. Incomplete diagrams. Ancient star maps unlike any current navigation charts. Images flickered across the chamber. Towering cities. Impossible orbital stations. Countless alien species standing together. At the center of every image. Humans. Not as conquerors. Not as rulers. As builders. Teachers. Engineers. One recording survived well enough to activate. The image shimmered into existence. A human woman wearing unfamiliar armor smiled directly toward the viewer. Her voice remained astonishingly clear despite the passage of millennia. If this archive survives. She paused. Then someone found our gifts. The chamber became perfectly still. We are the Terran Commonwealth. We built these tools for those who would come after us. Power without wisdom destroys civilizations. So every guardian weapon recognizes not rank, but responsibility. The recording flickered. If you are hearing this, humanity has likely failed. Our duty now belongs to you. The image vanished. Silence swallowed the archive. No one breathed. Captain Roger stared blankly at the empty space. Impossible. Our empire forged the blade. Sarikar slowly shook his head. No. His centuries of certainty crumbled with every word. We inherited it. Another scholar opened a different archive. Construction records. material analysis, energy signatures. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The blade predated Kharosi civilization by thousands of years. Queen Vale looked toward Elias. You knew nothing of this. It wasn't a question. He shook his head slowly. No. Our history says humanity first reached nearby stars only a few centuries ago. He stared at the ancient recordings in disbelief. If this is real. He struggled to finish the sentence. Everything we know about ourselves is wrong. The scholars continued searching. One elderly geneticist suddenly froze. There. She enlarged another section of the archive. A biological authentication system. Ancient DNA markers. The blade had never identified owners by bloodline. It identified something else. A dormant genetic sequence. One carried by every human ever born. The sequence activated only when extraordinary responsibility outweighed self-preservation. The sword had not mistaken Elias for someone else. It had recognized exactly what he was. The archivist whispered the conclusion. It wasn't judging his strength. It judged his character. Queen Vale closed her eyes briefly. She remembered the children, the flames, the burns spreading across his arm because he refused to let anyone else suffer. The blade had not attacked him. It had tested him. And he had passed. Not because he sought power, because he never once reached for it. Elias flexed his scorched fingers. The pain remained. The sword still refused to release him. So, he looked at the queen. What happens now? Before anyone could answer, a shrill alarm echoed through the ancient archive. Every crystal display turned crimson. The chamber lights dimmed. Captain Roger instinctively reached for his weapon. A communications officer burst through the massive stone doorway, struggling to catch his breath. Your Majesty, his voice cracked. Long-range observatories have detected an incoming fleet. Vale's expression hardened instantly. Identify them. The officer swallowed. We cannot. He activated a floating tactical display. Dozens of unknown warships appeared at the edge of the Kharosi system. None matched any known civilization. But one detail froze every person in the archive. On the hull of every vessel, glowing beneath layers of black armor, was the same ancient symbol burning along the blade fused to Elias's hand. The silence inside the Hall of Origins lasted only a heartbeat. Then the fortress shook. A low, distant vibration rolled through the ancient chamber, scattering centuries of dust from the towering shelves. Crystal archives chimed softly as emergency systems awakened for the first time in generations. The communications officer stared at the tactical display, his hands trembling. They're accelerating. Queen Vale stepped forward. To battle stations. The order carried the calm certainty of a ruler who had commanded armies through impossible odds. Captain Roger was already moving. Horn towers. Raise the planetary shields. Recall every patrol. Seal the capital. The officers rushed from the chamber. Within moments, warning sirens echoed across the fortress above. Kharos was preparing for war. The royal command chamber overlooked the volcanic plains through enormous transparent crystal walls. Normally, the view inspired pride. Today, it inspired dread. Dozens of black warships hung in orbit like predators circling wounded prey. They were unlike any vessels recorded in Kharosi history. No banners. No decorative armor. No ceremonial markings. Only smooth obsidian hulls interrupted by thin rivers of pale white light. Every ship carried the same ancient emblem now glowing faintly across the blade fused to Elias's hand. The resemblance was unmistakable. High Priest Sarikar whispered, "The Maker's mark." "No," Elias corrected quietly. "They're using it." Everyone looked toward him. He frowned at the display. The design language doesn't match the archive. The symbol is identical. The ships aren't. Captain Roger folded his arms. You can tell that? Elias nodded. The people who built the blade wanted others to understand it. He pointed toward the approaching fleet. These ships are designed to intimidate. A long silence followed. It was a mechanic's observation. Simple, practical, and somehow, everyone knew he was right. The largest enemy vessel moved ahead of the formation. Its sheer size eclipsed smaller escorts. Moments later, every display in the command chamber flickered. A transmission forced its way through every communication channel. Static, distortion. Then, an alien face appeared. Its skin resembled polished black stone, crossed by glowing silver fractures that pulsed like veins. For pale eyes studied the chamber without emotion. When it spoke, its voice sounded ancient, cold, certain. I am High Executor Kharos of the Void Dominion. No one interrupted. The being's gaze swept across the gathered leaders before settling briefly on Queen Vale. You shelter property belonging to the Dominion. Vale's expression hardened. Kharos shelters honored guests. The executor ignored the response. Return the last key. Your civilization will continue to exist. Captain Roger immediately looked toward Elias, then toward the blade. So, he muttered, they want the sword. The conclusion seemed obvious. Even Queen Vale believed it. She slowly reached toward Elias. If surrendering the blade prevents, the executor interrupted her. You misunderstand. The command chamber fell silent. The weapon is irrelevant. Every officer exchanged confused looks. Irrelevant? Then what? The alien's 4 eyes slowly shifted. Past the queen. Past the generals. Past every warrior. They stopped on Elias. At that exact moment, dozens of crimson targeting symbols appeared across every tactical display. Each one centered on a single life sign. Human. Elias Morgan. The room went completely still. The executor leaned closer. There. Our scanners confirm his identity. Captain Roger instinctively stepped between Elias and the display. What are you talking about? The alien almost sounded amused. You truly do not know. Another image appeared. Ancient battlefields. Burning planets. Ruined cities. Broken fleets stretching across entire star systems. The recordings were old. Very old. Yet unmistakably real. Your histories remember monsters. Our histories remember humans. The words chilled the room. For 12 centuries. We hunted them. The image changed again. Human ships. Outnumbered. Surrounded. Still fighting. Still refusing to surrender. Our greatest fleets failed. Our greatest admirals failed. Our greatest weapons failed. Each sentence carried growing frustration. They would rather perish than kneel. Another image. A human captain detonating his own flagship rather than allowing Dominion forces to seize it. Then another. Engineers destroying entire research stations before evacuation. Another. Soldiers defending civilians while retreating. Again. 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 The archive became a relentless record of impossible resistance. Elias stared in disbelief. We. His voice barely escaped. Did all this? The executor answered immediately. Yes. And because we could not conquer your species. We erased your history. The room fell silent. Queen Vale slowly looked toward Elias. The quiet engineer who apologized when stepping on someone's foot. Belonged to a civilization feared by an empire spanning the stars. Another display materialized. The blade. Ancient satellites. Hidden vaults. Massive orbital structures buried beneath dead worlds. The executor spoke carefully now. As long as humanity remained, the Guardian Network could awaken. Our empire could never rule without fear. Captain Roger frowned. Guardian Network? The alien answered. The greatest defense system ever created. It recognizes only one species. The executor raised a clawed hand.
Humans.
Every eye turned toward Elias. He slowly shook his head. I've never heard of it. We know. The executor's tone remained emotionless. Your ancestors hid it from us. They hid it from you. An uneasy murmur spread across the command chamber. One elderly general finally voiced the fear everyone shared. If they want only the human. He couldn't finish. Another officer did. Then perhaps. His voice shook. We should surrender him. The suggestion hung in the air like poison. Captain Roger closed his eyes. He hated the idea. But military logic cared little for honor. One life. Or billions. Another general nodded reluctantly. The Dominion came for him. Not Kharos. We cannot doom our people for a stranger. Several commanders quietly agreed. Even High Priest Sarikar lowered his gaze. Ancient law demanded sacrifice for survival. Elias listened without anger, without resentment. He looked toward Queen Vale. If they're right. She turned sharply. No. Elias, if giving me up saves your people, I said no. Her voice echoed through the chamber. Every officer froze. Vale stepped forward until she stood between Elias and every other person present. When my sword judged you, she said quietly, you protected children you had never met. You shielded my people while they pointed weapons at you. She faced her generals. And now you ask me to reward that courage with betrayal? No one answered. Her amber eyes burned brighter than the lava outside. Kharos was built upon honor. If we surrender an innocent guest to buy our own safety. She slowly drew her sidearm. Then we deserve neither. The chamber fell into absolute silence. Even Captain Roger straightened with renewed resolve. One by one, the other officers lowered their eyes. Shame spread across the room. Elias looked at Vale in quiet disbelief. No ruler had ever risked an entire world for someone she had met only hours before. He opened his mouth to speak. The fortress suddenly lurched violently. Alarms screamed. The tactical display exploded with flashing crimson warnings. An officer shouted from the communications station. Enemy weapons firing. Above the planet, the Void Dominion fleet unleashed its first wave. The orbital bombardment had begun. The first impact struck like the fist of a god. The entire royal fortress lurched sideways. Towering columns groaned under the strain, and cracks raced across sections of the vaulted ceiling. Dust and fragments of black stone rained onto the polished floor as the deafening boom echoed through every corridor. Outside, the volcanic horizon lit up, not from lava, from war. A mountain fortress on the western ridge disappeared beneath a column of white light. Moments later, the shockwave reached the capital, rattling windows and shaking the crystal walls overlooking the city. The command chamber erupted into motion. Shield generators dropping to 81%. The northern defense batteries are gone. 3 civilian districts have lost communication. Captain Roger barked orders without pause. Evacuate the lower sectors. Deploy interceptor wings. Keep those transports moving. Officers sprinted between tactical stations while warning sirens screamed through the fortress. Queen Vale remained perfectly still. Her eyes never left the burning cities below. They're targeting civilians, she whispered. The realization settled over the chamber like ice. The Void Dominion wasn't trying to conquer Kharos. It was forcing a decision. Surrender Elias. Or watch the planet die. Another blast rocked the fortress. This one closer. The crystal wall overlooking the valley rippled from the pressure wave. Elias instinctively reached toward it. His burned hand tightened around the fused blade. The white runes along its surface brightened. Almost. Responding. He looked down. The weapon vibrated gently beneath his fingers. Not violently, purposefully. as though trying to tell him something. He closed his eyes. "What are you trying to show me?" "Nothing. Only warmth." Not the searing agony he had endured before. A steady pulse, like a heartbeat. Then another memory surfaced. Not his own. The ancient recording. Every guardian weapon recognizes not rank, but responsibility. A key, not a sword. His eyes snapped open. It's not waking up because it wants a fight. Captain Roger looked over. "What?" Elias turned the blade in his hand, studying the glowing symbols. "This thing was never meant to be a weapon." "No?" The captain pointed toward the burning horizon. "It looks very much like one." Elias shook his head. "No, it looks like a key." Before anyone could question him further, Elias ran. He sprinted from the command chamber, boots pounding across volcanic stone. "Elias!" Vale called. He didn't stop. "The archives." Understanding flashed across the Queen's face. She followed immediately. Captain Roger cursed under his breath before leading the guards after them. Another bombardment shook the fortress. Chunks of stone crashed into empty corridors behind them. The race had become desperate. They reached the Hall of Origins just as another explosion extinguished half the chamber's lights. Ancient shelves had collapsed. Crystal tablets lay shattered across the floor. The air was thick with dust. Elias ignored the destruction. Instead, he walked directly toward the massive circular platform at the center of the archive. One detail had bothered him since arriving. The platform wasn't decorative. It was too perfectly aligned, too symmetrical, too engineered. He knelt beside it. His fingertips brushed shallow grooves hidden beneath centuries of ash. The grooves matched the glowing patterns running along the blade. "It fits." Queen Vale stared. "What fits?" "The sword." He looked at her. "I don't think your ancestors stored it here. I think." He took a slow breath. "They parked it." Without waiting for permission, Elias lowered the blade toward the center of the platform. Captain Roger stepped forward. "What if you're wrong?" Elias smiled weakly. "Then we've already got bigger problems." The sword touched the stone. Nothing happened. For one long second. Silence. Then the entire archive came alive. White light raced through the ancient grooves beneath the floor, spreading outward in every direction. The walls trembled. Massive mechanisms hidden for thousands of years awakened with deep metallic echoes. The ceiling split apart. Far above the fortress, volcanic rock exploded upward as gigantic structures forced their way toward the sky. Every display throughout the capital activated simultaneously. Across Kharos, ancient towers rose from forgotten mountains. Buried facilities opened beneath oceans of ash. Orbital silos shattered the crust of dormant volcanoes. The planet itself seemed to awaken. One stunned operator gasped over the communications network. "Unknown objects leaving the surface." Another voice shouted moments later. "They're not missiles." Thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. Ancient satellites burst into orbit from hidden launch chambers buried beneath the world. Each unfolded silently like metallic flowers opening toward the stars. The Guardian network had awakened. Far above the atmosphere, the Void Dominion fleet paused. High Executor Kharos watched the impossible unfold. "No." For the first time in centuries. Fear entered his voice. "Cannot be." Around his flagship, tactical displays filled with new contacts. Guardian satellites. Every one locking onto Dominion vessels. The Executor shouted. "Fire!" Hundreds of plasma lances erupted toward the growing swarm. None struck. The satellites danced through space with impossible precision, moving as though they anticipated every shot before it was fired. Within seconds, they surrounded the invading armada. Captain after captain waited for the killing blow. It never came. Instead, Thin beams of blue light connected every satellite to every Dominion ship. One after another, weapons shut down. Engines fell silent. Targeting systems went dark. Artificial gravity flickered. Communications failed. Missiles became useless metal. Shield generators powered off. Not a single ship exploded. Not one life was lost. The fleet simply stopped. Adrift. Helpless. Silence filled the command chamber aboard the Dominion flagship. Crew members frantically struck dead consoles. Primary weapons offline. Navigation gone. We've lost propulsion. The reactor isn't damaged. It simply refuses commands. Kharos stared at his powerless fleet. No explosions. No slaughter. Only complete defeat. He finally understood. Humanity had possessed the power to erase entire civilizations. Instead, they had designed a system that ended wars without ending lives. Back inside the Hall of Origins, the glowing light slowly faded. The blade loosened in Elias's hand for the first time. Its unbearable heat disappeared. Queen Vale looked from the quiet weapon to the peaceful tactical display now filling with immobilized enemy ships. Her voice was almost inaudible. You could have destroyed them. Elias looked toward the stars beyond the broken ceiling. Maybe. You didn't. He shook his head. If those old recordings taught us anything. He smiled sadly. It's that whoever built this wanted people to survive the war. Not just win it. Survive it. Vale finally understood why the blade had chosen him. Not because he was the strongest. Not because he was human. Because when offered unlimited power, his first instinct had been to use the smallest amount necessary. She bowed her head, not to a conqueror, to a protector. A final transmission pierced the silence. The image of High Executor Kharos appeared once more. Gone was the certainty. Gone was the arrogance. His flagship drifted powerless among thousands of silent warships. Slowly, deliberately, the ancient commander lowered himself onto one knee before the screen. Every Kharosi officer watched in disbelief. An enemy who had never bowed to any civilization, now knelt before one quiet human mechanic. Kharos lowered his head. His voice carried neither hatred nor fear, only recognition. Guardian. For a long moment, no one spoke. The Hall of Origins, once filled with alarms, frantic voices, and the thunder of distant bombardment, had become strangely peaceful. The tactical displays still hovered above the command tables, showing the same impossible sight. Thousands of Dominion warships drifted silently in orbit, intact, undamaged, powerless. Not one had been destroyed. Not one had fallen from the sky. The Guardian Network had ended a war without becoming one. Queen Vale slowly looked toward Elias. The white glow surrounding the blade of judgment had faded to a soft ember-like radiance. The unbearable heat was gone. The ancient runes no longer blazed with overwhelming power. Instead, they pulsed gently, almost content. The sword was no longer fighting him. It was waiting. Elias flexed his burned fingers. The hilt, which had been fused to his palm only moments earlier, loosened with a faint metallic click. He looked down in surprise. So, he murmured, I guess we're done. The blade slipped free without resistance. For the first time since he had picked it up in the Grand Hall, it rested naturally in his hand. No flames. No pain. Only silence. Far above Kharos, High Executor Kharos remained on one knee inside the bridge of his powerless flagship. None of his officers dared speak. They had spent centuries believing humanity had been dangerous because it possessed stronger weapons. Now they understood the truth. Humanity had been feared because it possessed something far rarer. The discipline not to use those weapons. Kharos closed all four eyes. We were wrong. The words were barely audible. An officer looked toward him. My executor? We believed power belonged to whoever could destroy. His voice carried centuries of regret. The Guardians believed power belonged to whoever could stop destroying. No one challenged him. There was nothing left to argue. The great gates of the royal fortress opened before sunset. Word had already spread across the capital. The bombardment had ended. The fleet had surrendered. The mysterious humans still lived. Citizens poured into the enormous plaza before the palace. Warriors who had fled in terror only hours earlier slowly returned, carrying the weapons they had abandoned. Captain Roger stood at the head of the assembled guard. He looked toward Elias with an expression completely different from the one he had worn that morning.
No suspicion.
No fear. Only respect. Queen Vale stepped onto the balcony overlooking the gathered thousands. A roar erupted from the crowd. Kharos, Kharos, Kharos. Then the queen raised one hand. The cheering stopped instantly. She turned toward Elias. Every eye followed. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, Captain Roger removed his helmet. He lowered himself onto one knee. The sound of metal echoed across the plaza. One by one, the royal guard followed. Veteran commanders knelt. Temple priests bowed their heads. The warriors who had once fled from the firebearer laid their weapons upon the volcanic stone and knelt beside them. Soon, thousands filled the plaza. None knelt before their queen. Every one of them faced Elias, not because they feared him, because they honored him. The silence that followed carried more weight than any victory parade. Elias shifted uncomfortably. Oh! He rubbed the back of his neck with his free hand. You really don't have to do this. No one moved. Queen Vale smiled for the first time that day. They disagree. An elderly child stepped out from the crowd. Or at least, the Kharosi equivalent of a child. Barely taller than Elias's waist, with tiny black horns just beginning to grow. She clutched a small carved wooden figure. It was crude, uneven, clearly handmade. She approached him carefully. My mother says. Her voice shook. You stood in the fire. Elias smiled softly. I suppose I did. She held out the little carving. It was a tiny figure standing with arms spread wide before a wall of flames. I made this. For you. The entire plaza watched. Elias accepted the gift with both hands as though it were priceless. Thank you. The child beamed before running back to her family. Queen Vale quietly noticed something. He had accepted the child's gift with greater reverence than the legendary sword itself. She finally understood why the blade had chosen him.
Val approached.
The blade of judgment still rested in Elias's hand. So, she asked gently, what does the Guardian do now? Elias looked at the ancient weapon. For several seconds, he simply studied the black metal. Then he turned. He held the sword out toward her. This belongs to you. The queen blinked. Chose you. I don't think it did. She frowned. It awakened for you. Tested me. He smiled. That's different. She slowly accepted the hilt. This time, nothing happened. No fire. No resistance. The blade settled naturally into her grasp. Its glow remained warm, peaceful, almost approving. Elias looked across the silent crowd. I don't think this sword was ever meant to choose rulers. Everyone listened. It exists to remind rulers. Remind us of what? Vale asked quietly. He looked toward the stars where the disabled Dominion fleet still drifted. That strength isn't measured by how many enemies you can destroy. He paused. It's measured by how many people you refuse to. The words settled over the plaza. No speeches followed. None were needed. Weeks later, the story spread beyond Kharos. Merchant vessels carried it to neighboring systems. Explorers repeated it around distant stations.
Scholars searched forgotten archives.
Old myths were questioned. Ancient records reopened. Again and again, civilizations discovered the same impossible truth. Humanity had not vanished because it had been weak. It had sacrificed its place in history so that others might inherit a safer galaxy. The Guardians had never ruled. They had protected. Even the Void Dominion withdrew from worlds it had occupied for generations. Not because its fleets had been destroyed, because every commander now feared one terrifying possibility. If one quiet mechanic could awaken a forgotten network after thousands of years, how many more Guardian worlds still slept among the stars? How many more keys remained hidden? And if humanity truly remembered who it once was, who could ever hope to conquer them? On the highest balcony of the royal fortress, Queen Vale watched a human shuttle lift into the ash-filled sky. Elias had refused medals. He had refused noble titles. He had refused command of armies. He had even refused a palace. He was simply going home. As the shuttle disappeared beyond the clouds, Vale rested the blade of judgment against her shoulder. For the first time in 6,000 years, she understood the purpose of the weapon she carried. It had never existed to crown the strongest. It existed to recognize those strong enough to choose compassion over conquest. And at last, the galaxy understood why even the greatest empires had once feared humanity. Not because humans mastered war, but because, when they possessed the power to rule everyone, they chose instead to protect everyone.